What if I told you there was a single night when one man's decision changed the destiny of Rome forever? And what if I told you that this moment was so shocking, so dangerous, that it wasn't just a political gamble, it was an act of treason, punishable by death? This is the story of Julius Caesar standing on the frozen banks of the Rubicon River in 49 BCE, staring into the dark waters that divided his loyal legion from the forbidden heart of Rome. Behind him, soldiers waited in tense silence. Ahead of him lay the republic he had sworn to serve, and the possibility of civil war. One step forward would ignite a firestorm that could never be undone. One step back would mean humiliation, disgrace, and perhaps even his own execution. Why did Caesar risk everything in that moment? What drove him to challenge the Senate, the laws of Rome, and centuries of tradition? And how did crossing a shallow Italian river unleash a chain of events that shattered the republic itself? If you've ever wondered how a single choice can topple an empire, you're in the right place. Stay with me, because over the next chapters, we're going to dive deep into betrayal, ambition, and the gamble that made Caesar immortal. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, because you won't want to miss this journey into the most dangerous decision in Roman history. Would you like me to now begin? Part 1 of the full script, around 2,000 words. Starting with Caesar's rise and the road that led him to the Rubicon. The rise of Caesar from ambition to the banquet. If greatness was never a matter of chance, but of relentless will. And what if one man, born into a crumbling republic, believed he alone could bend destiny to his favor? Before Julius Caesar stood at the Rubicon, before the world trembled at his choice, he was simply a man of cunning charm, fearless ambition, and dangerous enemies. To understand why he dared defy Rome itself, we need to walk the long road that carried him to the edge of treason. The world Caesar was born into. The late Roman Republic was not the glorious empire many imagine when they hear the name Rome. It was a fractured society, teetering between democracy and oligarchy, where senators feuded like rival kings, and corruption infected every level of power. The poor filled the city's streets, hungry and restless. The Senate, dominated by aristocrats, grew more arrogant and resistant to reform. And Rome's military conquests, stretching across the Mediterranean, produced vast wealth that flowed into the pockets of the elite, while the common soldier often returned home to poverty into this storm of inequality and unrest. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE. He came from an old patrician family, the Ulybut, by his birth. The family name had faded into obscurity. He was not destined for greatness by inheritance. Instead, Caesar carved out his path with intellect, charisma, and a daring streak that frightened as much as it inspired. The young man who dared too much from the very beginning. Caesar displayed one trait that would define his life. He refused to bow to fear. At just 16, he lost his father and became the head of his household. Shortly after, his boldness drew the wrath of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Rome's dictator. Sulla demanded that Caesar divorce his wife Cornelia, daughter of one of Sulla's enemies. Caesar, still a teenager, refused. That refusal nearly cost him his life. Sulla stripped him of his inheritance, his priesthood, and his safety. For months, Caesar lived on the run, hunted by assassins. Only after powerful relatives begged Sulla to show mercy was Caesar spared. Sulla reluctantly allowing the young man to live. Muttered words that would echo ominously through history. In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses. By this, Sulla meant Caesar carried the same dangerous ambition as his uncle by marriage. Gaius Marius, a reformer who had defied the Senate. It was a prophecy, and it was true. Caesar was a man who would never forget humiliation. The pirate episode, perhaps nothing reveals Caesar's character more than his infamous encounter with pirates. As a young man traveling across the Aegean, Caesar was captured by Cilician pirates who demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed. 20 talents. He told them he was worth at least 50. For weeks, he lived among them as a prisoner, but not as a victim. He joined in their games, mocked their incompetence, and even promised half-jokingly that he would return to crucify them all. The pirates laughed at this strange, arrogant Roman. But Caesar wasn't joking. Once ransomed, he quickly raised a fleet, hunted down the pirates, captured them, and executed them by crucifixion exactly as he had promised. It was a chilling display of his ruthlessness. To his friends, it showed courage. To his enemies, it revealed something far more dangerous. Caesar was a man who always kept his word. No matter how impossible it sounded, climbing the ladder of power in Rome, Caesar's rise was swift and calculated. He mastered the art of public speaking, dazzling crowds with his oratory and wit. He hosted games and spectacles, borrowing vast sums of money to win the people's favor. Debt meant little to him. Caesar believed power would always repay itself. He also knew how to charm allies. He forged connections with powerful figures like Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and Pompey, its most celebrated general. Together, they formed the first triumvirate secret alliance that allowed them to dominate Roman politics. But make no mistake, Caesar was not a man content to share power. Every alliance he made was temporary, every friendship conditional. For him, Rome was not a republic of equals, it was a prize waiting to be seized. The Gallic Wars, the making of a legend. When Caesar was appointed governor of Gaul, few in Rome understood what fortune had fallen into his lap. For nearly a decade, he waged brutal campaigns across modern France, Belgium, and parts of Britain. His victories were staggering. He crushed rebellious tribes, subdued entire regions, and brought immense wealth back to Rome. His conquest of Gaul not only expanded the republic's borders, but also transformed Caesar into the most feared and beloved general of his age. It was here that Caesar became a legend. His soldiers adored him because he shared their hardships, marching through mud, sleeping on the ground, and fighting beside them in battle. To them, Caesar was not just a commander, but a comrade. They would follow him anywhere, even against Rome itself. Yet in Rome, his enemies in the Senate grew anxious. Caesar's popularity was soaring, his military power unmatched. Many senators, especially the conservative faction known as the Optimates, whispered that he intended to make himself king. And in Rome, the very word king was poison. The inevitable clash by the late 50s BCE. Caesar's alliance with Pompey had crumbled. Once brothers in arms, they were now rivals. Pompey sided with the Senate, positioning himself as the defender of the Republic against Caesar's growing dominance. The Senate, eager to strip Caesar of his power, demanded that he disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen once his governorship ended. For Caesar, this was no mere legal order, was a death sentence. Without the immunity of his office and without his legions at his back, he would be prosecuted by his enemies, ruined, and likely executed. Caesar faced a choice: surrender everything he had built, or defy the Senate and march on Rome. The stage was set for the most fateful night in Roman history. The Rubicon River waited in the shadows, its shallow waters hiding the deepest gamble any man had ever taken. The night at the Rubicon, the point of no return. What would you do if one step forward promised glory, but also guaranteed war? And what if one step back meant disgrace, exile, and the end of everything you fought for? That was the dilemma Julius Caesar faced as he stood before the Rubicon River in January of 49 BCE. The world held its breath, because whatever he chose would not just decide his fate, would decide the fate of Rome itself. The tension before the crossing. Picture the scene: a cold Italian night, the wind cutting through the cloaks of thousands of legionaries camped nearby. Torches flickered, their light dancing against helmets and shields. The soldiers waited in tense silence, staring at their general. They knew what was at stake. Crossing this river was not just a march, it was treason. Roman law forbade any general from leading troops into Italy proper. To do so was to declare war on the Republic. And yet, for Caesar, retreat was impossible. He knew that the Senate, under the influence of Pompey and the Optimates, was demanding his surrender. He had been ordered to disband his army and return to Rome alone. But Caesar was not naive. He understood that stepping back meant political annihilation. He would be stripped of his titles, put on trial, and most likely executed by the very men who feared him. So he paced the riverbank. Caught between destiny and destruction, the whisper of historians said that Caesar hesitated. Walking back and forth, muttering to himself, he weighed every possibility. Some of his officers urged caution, reminding him that to defy Rome was to invite civil war, a war that would tear the Republic apart. Others urged boldness, knowing that fortune often favors the daring. In one of the most famous moments in history, Caesar spoke words that still echo today: Alia iacta est. The die is cast. With those words, he stepped forward. His horse splashed into the shallow waters, followed by the crunch of armored boots. Legion after legion crossed behind him. The Rubicon, once just a stream on the map, became a boundary between peace and chaos, between republic and empire. There was no turning back. The significance of the Rubicon. Why was this crossing so monumental? It was not about geography, it was about defiance. For centuries, Rome had prided itself on being a republic governed by laws, not by kings or tyrants. The very act of bringing an army into Italy shattered that illusion. Caesar had placed his own authority above that of the Senate. But here's the question: was Caesar really a traitor to the Republic? Or was he the only man bold enough to expose that the Republic was already broken? The truth is, Rome's democracy had been decaying for decades. Bribery-filled elections, violence-decided debates, and the Senate often ruled not for the people, but for the rich elite. Many ordinary Romans saw Caesar not as a villain, but as a champion against a corrupt system. So when he crossed the Rubicon, the people of Italy did not rise up against him. Instead, many welcomed him. To them, Caesar wasn't destroying the Republic, he was saving it. The panic and raw news of Caesar's crossing reached Rome like a thunderclap. Senators panicked. The Senate chamber, usually filled with fiery speeches and political games, turned into chaos. Those loyal to Pompey shouted for immediate resistance. Others quietly fled the city. Pompey himself, once Caesar's ally and now his rival, realized the danger. Though he was considered Rome's greatest general, he had not prepared for Caesar's sudden strike. When Caesar advanced with his legions, Pompey abandoned Rome, retreating south with the Senate and his forces. This was a shocking sight for the Roman people. Their leaders had fled, their defenders gone. And Caesar? He entered Rome not as a destroyer, but as a calm conqueror. There was no massacre, no burning of the city. He walked into the capital he once served, now ready to claim it for himself. A man of calculated mercy. One of the most fascinating aspects of Caesar's march on Rome was his mercy. Unlike other Roman generals who slaughtered their enemies, Caesar often pardoned those who opposed him. Senators who had fled were invited back. Citizens were spared bloodshed. Even soldiers of Pompey who surrendered were welcomed into his own army. But this mercy was not weakness. It was strategy. By forgiving his enemies, Caesar not only won the loyalty of the people, but also humiliated the Senate, proving he was stronger than their laws. Mercy, in Caesar's hands, was sharper than a sword. The march to civil war. Though Caesar controlled Rome, the Republic was not yet his. Pompey had retreated across the Adriatic, gathering forces in Greece. The Senate rallied to him, declaring Caesar an outlaw and Rome's enemy. The stage was now set for a brutal civil war, the likes of which Rome had not seen in a generation. Brothers would fight brothers, citizens would slaughter citizens, and the Republic itself would hang in the balance, and all of it, every drop of blood spilled, began with one step into a shallow Italian river. Suspense. Builds imagine being one of Caesar's soldiers. That night at the Rubicon. Did you know you were about to change history? Did you feel the weight of the Republic on your shoulders as you crossed the icy waters? Or were you simply following the man you loved, the general who ate at your fires, fought at your side, and never abandoned you? The truth is, for the men who crossed with him, loyalty was everything. They were not fighting for Rome, they were fighting for Caesar. And that loyalty would make him nearly unstoppable. Civil War. Caesar versus Pompey. What happens when two giants, once allies, turn their armies against each other? And what happens when the fate of a republic is not decided in the Senate chamber, but on the battlefield? This was the reality Rome faced after Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Civil war was no longer a threat, was here. Pompey, the great rival. To understand the scale of this war, we must first understand Pompey. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, was no ordinary man. Long before Caesar rose to power, Pompey had been Rome's golden boy. He had crushed rebellions in Spain, cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, and returned to Rome showered in triumph. He had paraded like a king, yet still claimed to serve the Republic. Caesar and Pompey had once been allies, even family through marriage, when Caesar gave his beloved daughter Julia to Pompey as a bride. But when Julia died in childbirth, the bond that held them together snapped. Without that tie, and with Caesar's victories in Gaul overshadowing Pompey's own glory, the two men became inevitable rivals, the Republic in exile after Caesar's daring march into Italy. Pompey and the Senate fled eastward to Greece. There, they built up a massive army, drawing soldiers, wealth, and allies from across the Republic's provinces. Pompey still had enormous prestige. Too many senators. He represented the last hope of saving the Republic from Caesar's ambition. But Caesar had something Pompey did not: momentum. His legions, hardened by years of conquest in Gaul, were veterans of endless campaigns. They were fiercely loyal to Caesar, willing to follow him through hunger, hardship, and death itself. Caesar's lightning campaign. The opening stages of the Civil War were marked by Caesar's breathtaking speed. He swept across Italy with minimal resistance. City after city opened its gates, either welcoming him or unwilling to face his legions. Within months, Caesar controlled the heart of Rome. He then turned west, seizing Spain, where many of Pompey's forces were stationed. At the Battle of Ilerda in 49 BCE, Caesar's brilliance as a strategist shone once again. Trapped between rivers, facing starvation, his forces seemed doomed. Yet Caesar's engineering genius allowed him to outmaneuver his enemies. Forcing their surrender without a massive battle with Spain under control, Caesar now turned east. The showdown with Pompey was inevitable. The clash of titans, Pharsalis' decisive moment, came in 48 BCE. At the Battle of Pharsalis, in central Greece. On one side, Pompey commanded nearly 45,000 men, an army larger, fresher, and bolstered by senators who saw themselves as the saviors of Rome. On the other side, Caesar stood with about 22,000 battle-worn veterans, outnumbered 2-1. Before the battle, Pompey was confident. He believed Caesar's army, weary from years of campaigning, would collapse under the sheer size of his forces. The senators in his camp mocked Caesar's soldiers as peasants and criminals. But Caesar knew better. As dawn broke, Caesar's men formed up in silence. He reminded them that they were not just fighting an army, they were fighting for their lives, for their general, and for the future of Rome. His soldiers, many scarred from years of conquest, did not need further encouragement. The battle began with Pompey's cavalry charging Caesar's right flank. The Senate's allies were sure this would break Caesar's line. But Caesar had anticipated this. He had hidden a fourth line of infantry, a secret reserve, behind his cavalry. At the crucial moment, they surged forward, striking Pompey's horsemen with a ferocity they did not expect. Pompey's cavalry panicked and fled, leaving his infantry exposed. Caesar's veterans pressed the attack. The field turned into chaos, dust and screams filling the air. By the end of the day, Pompey's massive army had been shattered. Tens of thousands lay dead or captured. Caesar's gamble had paid off. Pompey's fall. Pompey himself escaped the battlefield, fleeing to Egypt in search of safety. But in Egypt, treachery awaited him. The young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, eager to win Caesar's favor, had Pompey murdered as he stepped ashore. The great general who once commanded the loyalty of the Senate and Rome's armies was stabbed to death. His head cut off and presented to Caesar as a gift. When Caesar saw Pompey's severed head, he did not rejoice. Instead, he is said to have wept. For all their rivalry, Pompey had been a great Roman, once his ally, once his son-in-law. His end, at the hands of foreigners, was not the death he deserved. But with Pompey gone, Caesar now stood unrivaled. The Republic was at his mercy. The price of civil war yet victory came at a terrible cost. Rome was torn apart. Brothers had fought brothers, neighbors turned against neighbors. Entire regions had been ravaged. The Republic was bleeding, its institutions shattered, and still, the war was not over. Pompey's allies lived on. His sons rallied in Spain. Senators still plotted in hiding. And in Egypt, Caesar would be drawn into another drama, one that would bind him to one of the most famous figures in history, Cleopatra. The suspense ahead. Imagine being in Rome at this moment. You had seen your leaders flee, your army slaughtered, your republic crumble. Was Caesar a savior, or was he a tyrant in the making? Was he the man to restore order, or the man who would destroy freedom itself? Civil war had given him power, but it also gave him enemies who would never forget. And as Caesar turned his gaze to Egypt, destiny placed him on a path filled with both passion and peril. Caesar and Egypt, love, power, and betrayal. What happens when a conqueror of worlds meets a queen who refuses to bow? And what if, in the sands of Egypt, destiny brought together two of history's most magnetic figures? After defeating Pompey at Pharsalus, Julius Caesar expected to return to Rome as master of the Republic. Instead, he sailed into Alexandria and straight into one of the most dangerous, seductive, and unpredictable chapters of his life. The aftermath of Pompey's death when Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BCE. He came seeking Pompey, only to be presented with his rival's severed head. The young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, barely a boy, believed this brutal act would win Caesar's gratitude. Instead, it repulsed him. Pompey had been his enemy. Yes, but also a Roman consul, a great general, and a man of Rome. His execution at foreign hands was an insult, not just to Pompey, but to Rome itself. Caesar, though weary from years of campaigning, lingered in Alexandria. The city, glittering with wealth and history, was in turmoil. A civil war raged between Ptolemy XIII and his older sister Cleopatra, who had been driven from the throne but was determined to reclaim it. And then came the moment that would change. Cleopatra's entrance. Cleopatra, just 21, was clever, bold, and determined to outmaneuver her brother. She needed Caesar's support, but how could she reach him while his camp was guarded and hostile to her? The story goes that Cleopatra smuggled herself into Caesar's presence rolled up inside a carpetore. Some say a linen sack. When unrolled before the Roman general, she emerged not as a defeated exile, but as a queen who dared risk everything. Caesar, then in his early 50s, was captivated. Cleopatra's beauty was legendary, but it was her intelligence, wit, and audacity that charmed him. Unlike the senators in Rome who saw Caesar as a threat, Cleopatra treated him as an equal. Perhaps even as a partner in destiny. The Alexandrian war Caesar soon found himself embroiled in Egypt's civil war. He declared himself mediator between Cleopatra and Ptolemy, but in truth, he was already leaning in her favor. When riots erupted in Alexandria, Caesar was besieged in the royal quarter with only a fraction of his forces. Supplies dwindled, and the situation grew desperate. But Caesar thrived in desperation. He ordered his men to set fire to enemy ships in the harbor, preventing Ptolemy's forces from cutting him off by sea. The flames, however, spread uncontrollably. And legend says part of the great library of Alexandria was destroyed in the chaos. Reinforcements finally arrived, and Caesar led his troops in a bold counterattack. Ptolemy XIII fled but drowned in the Nile during his escape. Cleopatra was restored to the throne, now ruling jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV. Though everyone knew who truly held power, Caesar and Cleopatra with victory secured, Caesar remained in Egypt for months. During this time, his relationship with Cleopatra deepened. She bore him a son, Ptolemy Caesar, whom the Alexandrians called Caesarion. Little Caesar's affair with Cleopatra was scandalous. Rome had strict views on marriage, politics, and foreign entanglements. And here was their greatest general entwined with an exotic queen. But to Caesar, Cleopatra was more than a lover. She was a symbol of divine rule, of monarchy, of something greater than the decaying republic. Perhaps in her, Caesar saw a reflection of his own ambition. Imagine the sight: Caesar and Cleopatra sailing down the Nile in a golden barge, surrounded by musicians and soldiers, their banners rippling in the desert wind. Too many. It must have looked less like a romance and more like the dawn of an empire. Caesar's returned to Rome, but Rome could not wait forever. The Republic was still fractured. Pompey's sons were rallying in Spain, and his enemies in the Senate still plotted revenge. Caesar left Cleopatra behind, though not without ensuring her throne was secure. He would never forget her, and she would never forget him. Their bond would echo through history, entwining the destinies of Rome and Egypt for generations. When Caesar returned to Rome, he did so in triumph. He paraded through the streets, celebrating not just his victory over Pompey, but his conquests in Gaul, Spain, and the East. Spoils of war dazzled the crowds. Captives were marched in chains. The people hailed him as their savior, their champion, their unrivaled leader. But beneath the cheers, shadows lingered. The Senate had not forgotten that Caesar had crossed the Rubicon. Many feared he had crossed another line, that he was no longer content to be first among equals, but intended to make himself king, dictator in all but name in the years that followed. Caesar took control of Rome with astonishing speed. He declared himself dictator, first for short terms, then longer, until finally he was dictator for life. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar we still use in modified form today. He restructured debts, expanded citizenship, and passed laws to stabilize the republic. To his supporters, he was a visionary who had brought order to chaos. To his enemies, he was a tyrant who had destroyed the republic to crown himself monarch. And then came the whispers, the festivals, the honors, the statues. In the minds of many Romans, Caesar was stepping dangerously close to kingship. The Republic had executed kings centuries before would they now tolerate one disguised as a dictator. Suspense ahead. Picture yourself in Rome during this time. The streets are filled with banners praising Caesar. Coins bear his image. Senators bow before him. And yet, in the shadows, daggers are being sharpened. Men who once hailed him as a savior now conspire to end his life. Civil war had made Caesar master of Rome. Love had tied him to Cleopatra. Reforms had reshaped the Republic. But ambition, unchecked, had also painted a target on his back. The Ides of March, the death that shook Rome if the most powerful man in the world believed himself untouchable. And what if, in the heart of the Senate, surrounded by men he once called allies, that belief was shattered by 23 daggers? The Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, one of the most infamous days in history. It was the day Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, victor of civil war, and ruler of Rome, was brought down not by foreign enemies, but by his own countrymen. Shadows of conspiracies, Caesar's power grew. So too did resentment. Senators who once tolerated his authority began to whisper of tyranny. He had been named dictator, perpetua dictator for life. Statues of him appeared across Rome. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate. Crowds hailed him with honors once reserved for kings to the Roman elite. This was intolerable. The Republic had defined itself on its hatred of kings since expelling Tarquin the Proud centuries earlier. To them, Caesar was not a reformer. He was a monarch in disguise. And his crown would mean the death of liberty. Among the conspirators were some of the most powerful men in Rome. Cassius, a seasoned general who despised Caesar's arrogance. Casca, who feared the loss of the Republic. And Brutus, Caesar's friend and protege, whose name would become forever linked with betrayal. They convinced themselves they were not committing murder, but saving Rome. The final warning in the days before the Ides of March, omens filled the city. Soothsayers warned Caesar to beware the date. His wife, Calpurnia, dreamt of his statue running with blood and begged him not to attend the Senate meeting. Even his friends advised caution. On the morning of March 15th, Caesar hesitated. For a moment, it seemed he might remain at home. But Decimus Brutus, one of the conspirators posing as a loyal ally, persuaded him otherwise. The Senate awaited him, he said. To absent himself would seem weak. Caesar, ever proud, dismissed the warnings, cloaked in his crimson robe. He set out for the Curia of Pompey. The assassination inside the Senate, the conspirators gathered, each concealing a dagger. As Caesar entered, the room hushed. He took his seat, unaware of the storm about to break. Suddenly, a senator approached with a petition. As Caesar read, others crowded around him. Then, in a flash, steel gleamed. Casca struck first, slashing at Caesar's shoulder. Caesar turned, shocked, crying out, "Casca, what is this?" Then the others attacked. Dagger after dagger plunged into his body. The senators, once his allies, became a frenzied mob. Caesar fought at first, but when he saw Brutus raise his blade, he stopped resisting. Et2, Brute. He is said to have whispered, "You too, Brutus." Whether or not he spoke these exact words, the moment captured the deepest betrayal father figure. Struck down by his adopted son, Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, his blood pooling around the feet of the man he had once defeated. 23 wounds pierced his body. Rome's greatest general lay dead on the Senate floor. The shock in Rome, the conspirators expected to be hailed as liberators. They believed the people would celebrate the restoration of the Republic. But they miscalculated. Instead, Rome was thrown into chaos. The people mourned Caesar, their champion who had fed them, entertained them, and promised them a better life. At his funeral, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal ally, delivered a speech that shook the city. With fiery words, he stirred the crowd's grief into rage. He displayed Caesar's bloodied cloak, pointed to his wounds, and read his will, which left money and land to the Roman people. The crowd erupted into fury. They rioted, hunting the conspirators through the streets. Brutus, Cassius, and the others who thought themselves saviors fled for their lives. Far from restoring the Republic, they had unleashed more civil war. The fall of the Republic in the years that followed Caesar's death did not save the Republic. It destroyed it. His grandnephew and adopted heir, Octavian, rose alongside Mark Antony, hunting down the assassins in a brutal war. Eventually, Octavian emerged as the sole ruler of Rome, taking the title Augustus and becoming the first Roman emperor. The Republic was gone. In its place rose an empire, forged in blood and betrayal, and born on the banks of the Rubicon. Caesar's legacies. So what do we make of Caesar? Was he a tyrant who destroyed liberty, or a visionary who saw that the Republic was already rotting from within? Was his crossing of the Rubicon an act of selfish ambition, or the only way to break the cycle of corruption and violence that plagued Rome? The truth lies somewhere in between. Caesar was both a reformer and an autocrat, a man of mercy and a man of ruthless ambition. He changed Rome forever, and his name Caesar became a title for emperors for centuries to come. Even today, in the words Kaiser and Tsar, his shadow lingers. The final reflection: close your eyes and imagine that night at the Rubicon. Caesar, staring into the dark water, weighing his fate. Behind him, silence. Ahead, destiny. When he stepped forward, he set in motion events that no man, not even himself, could control. That step shattered a republic, gave birth to an empire, and ensured his name would never die. And so we are left with the eternal question: did Caesar cross the Rubicon? Or did the Rubicon cross Caesar?